There is a thought experiment that costs nothing to perform and everything to take seriously. Imagine you could press a button that would reveal, with total certainty, that morality is not real, not that murder is sometimes justified, not that ethics is complicated, not that different cultures disagree about right and wrong. Something more total than that. Imagine the button revealed that there has never been a single moral fact in the history of the universe. That you ought not torture children for fun is not true in the way that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level is true. That it is not true at all, in any sense stronger than chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla. Would you press it? Most people, asked this question honestly, hesitate. Not because they cannot imagine the answer being yes, morality is an illusion, but because they suspect that knowing it would change something in them that they are not prepared to lose. This hesitation is itself interesting. It suggests that morality is doing work in our lives that has nothing to do with whether it is metaphysically true. We want to believe some acts are objectively wrong the way we want to believe the ground will hold when we take a step. The wanting does not settle the question. It just tells you how much is riding on the answer. This is the territory of moral nihilism, and it deserves to be called the most dangerous idea in philosophy, not because it is the strangest or most confusing, but because it is the one idea that, if true, seems to license everything and forbid nothing. Skepticism about the external world is unsettling, but you cannot act on it. You still have to eat breakfast as though the world exists. Skepticism about free will is vertiginous, but people go on making choices anyway, compatibilist or not, because the machinery of decision does not pause for metaphysics. Moral nihilism is different. It is the one philosophical position that, taken seriously, seems to reach directly into the practical world and cut the wire connecting "I believe this is wrong" to "this is actually wrong." And once that wire is cut, what exactly stops a person from doing whatever they can get away with? That is the fear, anyway. It is the fear Dostoevsky dramatized in a Siberian prison camp of the mind, the fear Nietzsche diagnosed as the coming catastrophe of the next 2 centuries, the fear that respectable philosophy departments spent the 20th century trying to either refute or tame. And it is, this piece will argue, a fear that turns out to be substantially wrong about what actually happens when a person or a culture loses its grip on the idea that morality is written into the fabric of the universe. The strange and somewhat embarrassing truth, if you follow the argument all the way down, is that moral nihilism does not obviously produce monsters. It produces something much less cinematic and much more interesting: people who go on being kind, honest, and fair for reasons that have nothing to do with cosmic guarantees, because it turns out those reasons were doing most of the work all along. But we should not get ahead of ourselves. To understand why this is surprising, you have to understand how frightening the idea looked to the people who first stared directly at it. Start with the phrase that hangs over this entire subject like a held breath. God is dead. Friedrich Nietzsche put those words in the mouth of a madman who runs into a marketplace with a lantern lit in broad daylight, searching for God, and is mocked by the crowd of unbelievers standing around him. The madman turns on them. He tells them that they are the ones who killed God, all of them, with their own hands, and that they have not yet understood what they have done. He asks how they will comfort themselves, the murderers of all murderers. He asks what festivals of atonement, what sacred games, they will need to invent to be worthy of this deed. Then, having said all this, the madman falls silent, throws his lantern to the ground, and says that he has come too early, that this tremendous event is still on its way, still traveling, and has not yet reached the ears of men, even though they have done it. It is worth sitting with what Nietzsche was and was not saying here, because the passage is one of the most misunderstood in the history of philosophy. He was not celebrating atheism the way a triumphant scientist might celebrate the defeat of superstition. He was not saying, "At last we are free of the tyrant in the sky." He was delivering something closer to a diagnosis of a disease that the patient does not yet feel, the way a tumor can grow silently for years before symptoms appear. The death of God, for Nietzsche, meant the collapse of the entire architecture that had, for millennia, told European civilization what was good, what was true, and what mattered. Not just religious belief in a literal deity, but the whole scaffolding of transcendent value that this belief supported. The idea that there is a fixed order to the cosmos, a moral law built into the structure of reality itself, against which human conduct can be measured and found wanting or worthy. Strip away God, and, Nietzsche thought, you do not just lose a belief. You lose the ground the belief was standing on, and it takes an enormous amount of intellectual furniture down with it. Objective morality was one of the largest pieces of that furniture, and it does not survive the collapse of its foundation any better than anything else does. This is the shape of what Nietzsche called nihilism, and it is worth being precise about the word, because in ordinary conversation nihilist has become an insult meaning something like person who believes in nothing and therefore does terrible things, a cartoon villain, a Big Lebowski punchline. Nietzsche's nihilism is not a lifestyle choice or a personality type. It is a historical and psychological condition, the state a civilization enters when its highest values devalue themselves, when the things people believed gave existence meaning and structure turn out, on inspection, to have no foundation at all. He thought European culture was living through exactly this transition and mostly did not know it yet, the way a body can be infected long before the fever breaks. The apparatus of Christian morality, the idea of objective good and evil, of sin and redemption, of a moral order underwriting the universe, had been quietly hollowed out by centuries of its own intellectual honesty. Christianity, Nietzsche argued with a kind of grim admiration, had trained Europeans to value truth so highly as a moral duty, that eventually that very commitment to truth turned back on the religious claims themselves and found them wanting. The system ate itself. What was left standing, for a while, was the shape of the old moral commitments with the content scooped out, values people continued to live by out of habit and social pressure long after the metaphysical guarantee behind them had quietly expired. Nietzsche distinguished between two responses to this condition, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding why moral nihilism does not have to end where everyone assumes it ends. The first response he called passive nihilism. This is nihilism as exhaustion, as the shrug of a person or a culture that has lost its values and simply gives up trying to replace them, sliding into apathy, hedonism without vitality, a kind of grey comfortable despair. Picture the last man, the figure Nietzsche invokes with something close to contempt in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the human type who has made himself small and safe, who blinks and asks what love is, what creation is, what longing is, who has invented happiness and does not want to leave his corner, who values comfort above all else and finds even the memory of striving faintly embarrassing. The last man is what happens when you experience the death of objective values as pure loss and respond by lowering your expectations of existence until nothing can disappoint you anymore because you no longer want anything large enough to be disappointed about. The second response Nietzsche called active nihilism, and this is where the idea gets genuinely dangerous in the interesting sense, not the moralized sense. Active nihilism is not a shrug. It is an act of will. It says, fine, the old values are gone, the foundation has collapsed, and rather than mourning that fact forever or pretending otherwise, I will use the collapse as clearing ground. I will not wait for new values to be handed down from somewhere else because there is no somewhere else anymore. I will create them. This is the origin of Nietzsche's most notorious and most misread idea, the will to power, and of his image of the Übermensch, the human being who does not discover values lying around in the universe waiting to be found, but who legislates values into existence through the sheer creative force of a life fully and courageously lived. Nietzsche's affirmative answer to nihilism was not a return to comfortable belief. It was something closer to an aesthetic and existential dare, since nothing given can save you, become someone capable of saying yes to existence anyway, without the old guarantees, without the promise of cosmic justice or final meaning. His doctrine of eternal recurrence, the thought experiment in which you are asked whether you could will to live your exact life over again infinitely, forever, in every detail, was designed as a kind of ethical test for a post-nihilistic person. Not is this life objectively good, a question Nietzsche thought had become unanswerable, but can you affirm this life so completely that you would choose it eternally, without appeal to any court higher than your own capacity to say yes? This is important groundwork for everything that follows, because Nietzsche saw something that a lot of later thinkers missed in their rush to either defend objective morality or panic about its absence. He saw that the death of objective value does not automatically produce chaos or cruelty. It produces a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by whatever is nearby and has enough force to fill them. Sometimes that is despair. Sometimes it is fanaticism, people so terrified of the vacuum that they throw themselves at any ideology, political or religious, that promises to refill it with certainty, which is one way of understanding the totalitarian movements of the century that followed Nietzsche's death, movements he did not live to see but in some ways anticipated with real dread. And sometimes, Nietzsche insisted, the vacuum gets filled by something else entirely, a harder, more honest, more creative relationship to value, one where a person builds a life worth living because they have decided to, not because the universe promised them it was worth living in advance. Whether Nietzsche's own answer to nihilism is satisfying is a separate question, and there are good reasons to think his solution asks more of human psychology than most human beings can actually deliver, that the Übermensch is less a realistic destination than a rhetorical flourish, a way of gesturing at the scale of the problem rather than solving it, that the framing itself, the insistence that losing objective values is not automatically identical to losing all values, is the single most important move in this entire subject, and almost everything that comes after in this piece will be, in one way or another, an argument about whether Nietzsche was right about that. It helps to see where this idea of self-created value came from within Nietzsche's own earlier work, because the death of God passage in the gay science did not appear out of nowhere. Several years before writing it, Nietzsche had already published On the Genealogy of Morals, a book that tried to do something almost nobody had attempted before: treat morality itself, the very distinction between good and evil, not as a fixed starting point for philosophical inquiry but as a historical phenomenon with a traceable origin, subject to the same kind of investigation you might apply to the history of a language or a legal system. Nietzsche's genealogical method asked not what is good, in the abstract, as though the concept had simply always existed in its current form, but where did our current concept of goodness come from, and whose interests did it originally serve? His answer was deliberately provocative. He argued that what we now call morality, particularly the cluster of values centered on humility, self-sacrifice, compassion, and the suspicion of pride and strength, did not originate as a disinterested discovery of moral truth. It originated, he claimed, as a kind of psychological revolt. In the ancient world, Nietzsche argued, good originally meant something close to noble, strong, life-affirming, powerful, the qualities the aristocratic, martial classes admired in themselves, while bad simply meant common, weak, low. This is what he called master morality, a system of value created by the powerful to describe and celebrate their own vitality, with little interest in a separate category of transgression or sin. The powerful simply acted, and called their own actions good because they were the ones performing them. But over historical time, Nietzsche argued, a different moral vocabulary emerged from those who were on the losing end of this arrangement: the weak, the oppressed, the priestly classes without physical or political power. Unable to compete with the masters on the masters' own terms, this group performed what Nietzsche called a transvaluation of values, a kind of moral revolution achieved not through force but through a reinterpretation of the entire evaluative landscape. The very qualities the masters possessed and celebrated, strength, pride, the will to dominate, were redefined as evil, while the qualities the powerless already had by default, meekness, poverty, suffering, humility, patience, were redefined as good, even holy. Nietzsche called this slave morality, and he saw its triumph embodied above all in the historical victory of Christianity across the ancient Mediterranean world as one of the most consequential psychological events in human history, a genuine reversal of an older evaluative order achieved through what he called ressentiment, a corrosive, repressed resentment of the powerful by the powerless that eventually curdled into an entire moral system built on making the strong feel guilty for being strong. It is easy to misread this as Nietzsche simply cheering for cruelty and bullying, an aristocrat's contempt for the weak dressed up in philosophy, and plenty of careless readers, including some who used and abused his work for horrifying political purposes in the century after his death, have read it exactly that way. But that misreads both the tone and the purpose of the genealogy. Nietzsche was not primarily trying to argue that master morality was correct and slave morality was mistaken, as though he were simply substituting one set of objective values for another. He was trying to demonstrate something more radical and more directly relevant to this piece, that the moral categories people treat as eternal, self-evident and objectively given, the very distinction between good and evil that most people assume has always existed in roughly its current shape, was in fact assembled piece by piece out of specific historical struggles between specific groups of human beings with specific competing interests. If Nietzsche was right about this, even in broad outline, then the sense of objective moral certainty most people carry around, the feeling that good and evil name real, fixed categories rather than the sediment of an ancient psychological and political struggle, is itself something to be explained rather than simply trusted. This is exactly the same intellectual move that later shows up in a very different technical vocabulary in Sharon Street's evolutionary argument. Both Nietzsche and Street are asking the same unsettling question: not are our moral beliefs true, but given what we know about where these beliefs actually came from, should we expect them to be true? Nietzsche's genealogy and modern evolutionary debunking arguments are, in this sense, close cousins separated by more than a century, one working through cultural and psychological history, the other through population genetics and game theory, both arriving at the same disquieting suspicion that our moral convictions were shaped by forces that had no particular stake in getting the metaphysics right. Before we get there, though, we need to sit inside the fear itself, because the fear is not stupid, and the person who dramatized it most powerfully was not a philosopher constructing an argument, but a novelist constructing a mind and letting it think its way to the edge of the abyss in real time. Fyodor Dostoevsky never wrote the sentence that gets attributed to him constantly in exactly the words people quote. Nowhere in the Brothers Karamazov does a character say, in so many words, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." The line is a compression, a paraphrase so useful that it eventually became more famous than the actual text it summarizes, which happens sometimes with ideas that are too good not to sharpen into a slogan. But the thought is genuinely there, and it belongs above all to Ivan Karamazov, the middle brother, the intellectual, the one who cannot make himself believe and cannot make himself stop caring about whether belief is possible. Ivan's argument, delivered across a long, devastating conversation with his younger brother Alyosha in a tavern, does not start with abstract metaphysics. It starts with children. Ivan has apparently spent time collecting stories, real accounts of cruelty inflicted on children, a Turkish soldier tossing an infant in the air and catching it on a bayonet in front of the mother, a 5-year-old girl locked in an outhouse overnight by her own parents and made to eat her own excrement as punishment for wetting the bed, her cries met with her mother smearing her face with the filth and forcing her to eat it, a Russian general who sets his hounds on a serf boy and has him torn apart in front of his mother for the crime of accidentally injuring the general's favorite dog with a stone. Ivan does not tell these stories to make an abstract philosophical point about theodicy in the seminar room sense. He tells them because he wants Alyosha and the reader to feel the specific, unbearable, non-negotiable wrongness of what happened to those children before any system, religious or philosophical, gets a chance to explain it away. And then Ivan does something audacious. He says that even if there is a God, even if there is some grand cosmic harmony at the end of history in which every tear is redeemed and every wrong is somehow woven into a justified whole, he refuses the ticket. He will not accept a universe in which the suffering of one tortured child is the price of admission for eternal harmony, no matter how glorious that harmony turns out to be. It is not that Ivan cannot believe in God's existence on intellectual grounds, exactly. It is that he refuses to accept the moral bargain that seems to be built into existence, the idea that unimaginable suffering could ever be justified by a sufficiently good outcome elsewhere in the ledger. He returns his ticket. This is the famous line, and it is worth noticing that it is not really an argument against the existence of God at all. It is a moral protest against the entire structure of justification, a refusal to let any explanatory system, theological or otherwise, launder that particular horror into something acceptable. This matters for our subject because Ivan's rebellion looks, on the surface, like the ultimate expression of confident moral realism. He is certain, more certain than almost anyone else in the novel, that what happened to those children was objectively wrong in a way that no theological accounting could redeem. And yet this same character is also the one who develops, alongside his half-brother Smerdyakov, the philosophical position that without God, without some transcendent guarantor of the moral law, nothing is actually forbidden. Everything is permitted. This is the paradox that makes The Brothers Karamazov one of the great philosophical novels rather than a novel that merely contains philosophy. Ivan feels the wrongness of cruelty with his whole body and at the same time constructs with his intellect an argument that there is no foundation underneath that feeling strong enough to make it binding on anyone else or even, in the end, on himself. The horror of the novel is what happens when that idea leaves the tavern and enters the world. Smerdyakov, the illegitimate half-brother, the servant, a man treated his whole life as something less than fully human by the Karamazov family, takes Ivan's intellectual position with lethal literalism. If there is no God, and therefore no ultimate moral law, then the difference between right and wrong is just another social convention invented by the strong to control the weak, and a sufficiently clever man is not bound by it any more than he is bound by the rules of a game he has decided not to play. Smerdyakov murders their father, old Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, and does so believing, correctly or not, that he is simply carrying out the logical conclusion of Ivan's own philosophy, a philosophy Ivan articulated in conversation without ever quite intending it as a permission slip for patricide. When Ivan realizes what has happened, that his ideas did not stay safely in the realm of intellectual play but walked out into the world and killed his father, he does not experience vindication. He experiences a psychological collapse, a descent into fever and hallucination visited by a devil who is tellingly not a grand cosmic tempter but a shabby, bourgeois, faintly ridiculous figure, an externalization of Ivan's own doubts, mocking him for ever having believed his ideas were merely ideas. This is Dostoevsky's real argument, and it is more subtle than the slogan "If God is dead, everything is permitted" suggests when it is lifted out of context and used as a bumper sticker for religious apologetics. Dostoevsky is not simply saying that atheists have no reason to be good, full stop, case closed. He is dramatizing something more specific and more psychologically acute, that human beings who intellectually convince themselves morality has no objective foundation do not thereby become free of moral feeling, but they can become unmoored from the ability to justify that feeling to themselves or to resist ideas, including their own ideas, that would override it. Ivan's tragedy is not that he stops caring about right and wrong. It is that his caring and his thinking come apart, and the thinking, unanchored, becomes dangerous precisely because it retains enough force to be acted on by someone else, someone with fewer competing feelings to hold it in check. There is a second, quieter argument buried in Dostoevsky's earlier and shorter book, Notes from Underground, and it deserves mention because it approaches the same territory from a completely different angle. The unnamed narrator of that book, the underground man, is not a murderer or a grand philosophical villain. He is a petty, spiteful, self-lacerating former civil servant who spends the book arguing against precisely the kind of rationalist utopianism that was fashionable among Russian progressive thinkers of Dostoevsky's era. The idea that if you could simply calculate the objectively correct rational self-interest of every human being, you could engineer a perfectly harmonious society, a crystal palace of pure reason where nobody would ever act against their own good because their own good would be scientifically self-evident. The underground man's rebellion against this vision is worth pausing on because it is, in its own way, a rebellion against a certain kind of objective morality too, not religious morality this time but Enlightenment rationalist morality. The idea that the good is simply whatever reason calculates to be in everyone's true interest. He insists with real venom that human beings will deliberately act against their own rational interests, will deliberately choose suffering and self-destruction purely to prove that they are not piano keys, not mere mechanisms executing the dictates of a calculated moral or rational order imposed on them from outside, even a benevolent one. Whatever mankind is, the underground man says it is not primarily a rational calculator of the good, and any morality built entirely on that assumption will eventually meet a human being who wants, above everything else, simply to exercise their own capricious will, if only to prove that the will exists. Put Ivan and the underground man together and you get Dostoevsky's full case against the philosophical comfort of a world without objective moral foundations. Not that such a world is impossible to imagine, but that human beings navigating it tend to do one of two things, neither of them reassuring. They either let go of moral restraint because they have convinced themselves nothing restrains anyone, the Smerdyak path, or they rebel against any morality, objective or constructed, purely because being told what is good, even correctly, wounds their sense of freedom, the underground man's path. Dostoevsky's own answer, worked out more fully in later novels, particularly in the figure of the elder Zosima in the Brothers Karamazov, was a return to a very specific kind of religious faith, one grounded not primarily in doctrine or fear of punishment but in active practical love, in taking responsibility for everyone and everything, a faith that he believed could not be arrived at through pure intellect alone but only through a kind of humbling of the intellect before something larger. It is worth being honest about the limits of Dostoevsky's argument here, because this piece is not going to end up agreeing with him, even though it takes him completely seriously. His case is a psychological and literary case, an extraordinarily powerful one, about what can happen to certain kinds of minds, particularly proud, isolated, overly intellectual minds cut off from ordinary human attachment, when they conclude that morality has no objective foundation. It is not, strictly, a philosophical argument that objective morality must exist, or even that most people who stop believing in it become murderers or petty saboteurs of their own happiness. Ivan Karamazov is a specific kind of person in a specific kind of crisis, brilliant, guilty, disconnected from the people around him, carrying an unbearable weight of unprocessed feeling about cruelty that his intellect cannot metabolize. Dostoevsky himself, notably, gives us other characters in the same novel, Alyosha above all, who represent a very different relationship to goodness, one grounded in something closer to instinct, love, and practice than in metaphysical arguments, suggesting that even within the novel's own moral universe, the connection between belief in objective moral facts and the capacity to actually be good is more complicated than the famous slogan implies. There is one more piece of the novel worth dwelling on, because it is often treated as a separate set piece rather than as part of the same argument, and that is the legend Ivan composes and recites to Alyosha, the story of the Grand Inquisitor. In Ivan's imagined tale, Christ returns quietly to 16th century Seville during the height of the Spanish Inquisition, performs a few small miracles, and is immediately arrested by the Church's own Grand Inquisitor, an old cardinal who visits him in his cell at night not to condemn him as an impostor but to explain, with real anguish, why the Church must burn him the next morning anyway. The Inquisitor's argument is that Christ, in refusing the three temptations offered by the devil in the wilderness, refusing to turn stones to bread, refusing to cast himself from the temple to prove his divinity through spectacle, refusing worldly dominion, made a catastrophic error because he overestimated human beings. He gave them freedom, the terrifying freedom to choose good or evil for themselves, when what human beings actually want, the Inquisitor insists, is not freedom but bread, miracle, and authority, someone to take the unbearable burden of moral choice off their shoulders and simply tell them what to do. The Church, the Inquisitor confesses, corrected Christ's mistake. It took away the freedom he offered and gave people, in exchange, security, structure, and the comfort of never having to decide anything difficult for themselves. Ivan's Grand Inquisitor is not really a story about a corrupt priest so much as it is a second complementary argument about what happens to human beings under the weight of an unsupported freedom, and it deserves to be placed directly beside the everything is permitted idea rather than read as a separate episode. The Inquisitor's claim is essentially that most people, confronted with genuine moral freedom, freedom unbacked by any external guarantee, will not become Nietzschean creators of value. They will instead find the freedom unbearable and will trade it away, gladly, to any authority willing to take responsibility for their choices in exchange for obedience. This is Dostoevsky's version of what Nietzsche called passive nihilism, dramatized as a political and psychological mechanism rather than a cultural mood. When the metaphysical fraud disappears, most people, the Inquisitor wagers, will not rise to Nietzsche's challenge of self-legislation. They will instead reach for the nearest authority, religious or secular, willing to hand the floor back to them, even at the cost of their freedom, and history's totalitarian movements, arriving decades after Dostoevsky's death, gave this warning a horrifying concreteness he could not have fully anticipated but seemed, in the Inquisitor's speech, almost to foresee. This warning has to be taken seriously, and this piece is not going to pretend that authoritarian retreats from moral freedom are merely a hypothetical risk. They are a recurring and devastating feature of modern history. But notice what the Inquisitor's argument actually shows and does not show. It shows that human beings, faced with the loss of an external moral guarantee, are vulnerable to a particular failure mode, trading freedom for the false comfort of imposed certainty. It does not show that the loss of the guarantee itself produces cruelty directly. The cruelty in Dostoevsky's parable, and in the totalitarian movements that echo it, comes from what fills the vacuum of false, coercive replacement certainty, not from the vacuum's mere existence. This distinction matters enormously for the rest of this piece because it means the real danger Dostoevsky identified is not moral nihilism as such but a specific and avoidable psychological response to it, the flight into authoritarian certainty, and the alternative to that flight is not indifference but exactly the kind of hard, self-owned, constructed morality that later thinkers in this tradition, including Mackie, worked out in careful detail. But the fear Dostoevsky articulated so powerfully needed to be answered by philosophy directly, in its own terms, not just dramatized. And roughly a century after Dostoevsky, an Australian philosopher named John Leslie Mackie sat down and, with a kind of chilly, methodical clarity that could not be more different from Dostoevsky's fevered prose, argued that Ivan Karamazov's intellectual instinct was, as a matter of fact, correct. There are no objective moral facts. And then Mackie went on calmly to argue that this did not mean what everyone assumed it meant. Mackie's 1977 book, Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, opens with one of the most quietly startling sentences in modern philosophy: there are no objective values. Not it is hard to know whether there are objective values. Not objective values are a matter for faith, but a flat metaphysical claim, defended across the rest of the book with the patient, almost bureaucratic rigor of a man building a legal case rather than delivering a prophecy. Mackie's position has come to be known as moral error theory, and it is worth being precise about what makes it different from other skeptical positions in ethics, because the differences matter enormously for what comes later in this piece. Error theory has two parts, and both parts need to be held in mind at once. The first part is a claim about the meaning of ordinary moral language, what philosophers call the semantic or conceptual claim. When ordinary people say cruelty is wrong, Mackie argued, they are not merely expressing a personal preference, the way they would be if they said cruelty is distasteful to me. They are, whether they realize it or not, making a claim that purports to be objectively true, true independently of what anyone thinks or feels about it, true in a way that is supposed to bind anyone regardless of their desires, the way 2 + 2 = 4 is supposed to bind anyone regardless of what they want 2 + 2 to equal. Ordinary moral discourse, in other words, has a kind of built-in ambition to objectivity. When you say murder is wrong, you are not reporting your own attitude, you are asserting that there is a fact of the matter, a fact that exists whether you personally approve of murder or not, a fact that would remain true even if every single person on earth suddenly decided murder was fine. The second part of error theory is the claim that this ambition fails. There are no such objective moral facts for our moral claims to be about. And this means that ordinary moral statements, understood the way ordinary people actually mean them, are, strictly speaking, all false. Not meaningless, the way logical positivists had once argued moral statements were mere expressions of emotion dressed up as propositions, hurrah for kindness, boo for cruelty, with no truth value at all. Mackie thought moral statements were genuinely true fact, genuinely capable of being true or false. They just always turn out false, because the objective properties they are trying to describe do not exist. This is why it is called an error theory. Ordinary moral thought and language is not empty, it is systematically mistaken, built around a category that has no instances, the way a culture's entire vocabulary of witchcraft could be perfectly meaningful, genuinely asserting things, while nonetheless being uniformly false because there are no witches. Why did Mackie think objective moral values do not exist? He offered two central arguments, and both have become permanent fixtures of the metaethics literature, endlessly discussed, endlessly contested, and never quite dislodged. The first is the argument from relativity, sometimes called the argument from disagreement, though Mackie's version is more careful than the crude different cultures disagree, therefore there is no moral truth reasoning that gets attributed to relativists in introductory ethics classes. Mackie's point was not simply that people disagree about morality, since people disagree about all sorts of things that nonetheless have objective answers, like the age of the universe or the causes of a disease. His point was about the character and pattern of moral disagreement. Radical and persistent disagreement about morality, he argued, is much better explained by the hypothesis that different societies and individuals have adopted, absorbed, and been shaped by different ways of life, and have then constructed moral codes that reflect and reinforce those ways of life, than by the hypothesis that everyone is fumbling toward the same set of objective moral facts and some are simply seeing more clearly than others. When scientists disagree about the causes of a disease, there is a shared method, observation, experiment, evidence that everyone agrees is in principle capable of resolving the dispute, even if it takes time. Moral disagreement, Mackie thought, does not look like that. It looks much more like the disagreement you would expect if different groups had simply built different moral practices around different social conditions and were not, at bottom, all trying to track the same external reality. The second argument is more purely metaphysical and epistemological, and it is the one that has generated the most philosophical firepower over the decades since. Mackie called it the argument from queerness, and the name is deliberately blunt. Suppose, he says, that objective moral values did exist. What would they have to be like? They would have to be entities or properties of a totally different kind from anything else in the universe that we know about. Consider the property of wrongness if it were objective in the sense moral realists want. It would have to be a property such that simply perceiving an act with this property, recognizing that it has it, would automatically motivate you to avoid doing it, or at least give you a reason to avoid it that exists independently of any desire or interest you happen to have. This is utterly unlike any other property in the natural world. The property of being triangular does not, just by being perceived, generate a motivation in the perceiver. The property of being poisonous does generate a reason to avoid the poisoned thing, but only because you already have a desire not to die. Strip away that desire and the poison gives you no reason at all. Objective moral wrongness, as most people actually understand the concept, is supposed to give you a reason to avoid the wrong act regardless of what you desire, a reason that would apply even to a being with no self-interest in the matter whatsoever. Mackie thought this was a metaphysically bizarre, queer kind of property to posit, radically different from anything else science or ordinary experience gives us evidence for, and that positing it required an entirely special faculty of moral perception or intuition to detect it, a faculty conveniently immune to all the ordinary tests we use to check whether our perceptual faculties are reliable. Simplicity and parsimony, the same principles that tell scientists not to multiply entities beyond necessity, tell us, Mackie argued, to reject a category of fact this strange and this poorly evidenced. Now here is the part of Mackie that gets lost when people flatten error theory into philosopher proves morality is fake to nihilistic chaos. Mackie was extremely careful, almost fussy, about separating the metaethical claim, the claim about whether moral facts exist, from what philosophers call the normative or first-order question, the question of what we should actually do, how we should actually live, which acts are cruel or kind, fair or exploitative. Mackie thought these were entirely different projects. Discovering that moral judgments are not objectively true does not, on his view, tell you anything at all about how you should now behave, because the should in that question is itself either another moral claim, which would be equally without objective foundation, or it is a practical question about what kind of life is worth living given the psychological and social creatures we actually are, a question that does not evaporate just because the metaphysics changed underneath it. This is the crucial move, and it is worth dwelling on because it directly answers Dostoevsky's fear rather than dodging it. If Ivan Karamazov's slogan were straightforwardly true, if the absence of objective moral facts really did entail that literally anything goes, that there is no longer any reason whatsoever to prefer kindness to cruelty, you would expect Mackie himself, having spent an entire book demolishing the objectivity of morality, to end that book with either despair or a shrug of moral indifference. He does neither. Mackie spends the second half of Ethics inventing right and wrong, doing something that looks, on its face, almost contradictory, constructing a substantive, practical ethical theory, closer to a sophisticated utilitarianism grounded in cooperative self-interest and the resolution of conflicting human desires, and arguing for it with real conviction. The title of the book is not accidental. Inventing Right and Wrong. Mackie's position was not that morality should now be abandoned, but that morality had, in a sense, always been something humanity invented rather than discovered, a technology built to manage the perennial problem of limited resources and competing desires among creatures who have to live together, and that recognizing it as an invention rather than a discovery changes nothing about how urgently we still need it or how carefully we should still build it. You do not stop needing traffic laws because you realize the specific side of the road you drive on is a convention rather than a law of physics. The conventionality of the choice does not remove the need for a choice, and it does not make the choice arbitrary in any sense that matters, because the choice is still constrained by real facts about collision, safety, and coordination. It is worth pausing on exactly how Mackie built the positive, constructive side of his theory, because this is the part almost never quoted in the popular shorthand version of error theory, and it is the part that does the most direct work against the Dostoevskian fear. Mackie argued that even without objective moral facts, human beings still face a real, unavoidable, structural problem: limited resources, competing desires, and the need to live and cooperate with other people whose interests will inevitably sometimes conflict with one's own. This problem does not go away when the metaphysics changes. A creature with desires, living among other creatures with desires in a world of scarcity, needs some way of adjudicating conflicts and coordinating behavior, or life becomes worse for everyone involved, including the strongest and most ruthless members of the group, who still depend on a functioning society to have anyone to exploit, anything to steal, any reputation to protect, any offspring to raise in safety. Mackie called this the problem morality exists to solve, and he thought it was a real, practical, urgent problem regardless of whether any of the solutions to it carry cosmic endorsement. His own preferred approach, worked out with considerable care, was a version of what he called a second-order theory built on first-order content borrowed from a broadly consequentialist and cooperative tradition, rules and dispositions that, on the whole, tend to reduce unnecessary suffering, resolve conflicts of interest fairly, and make cooperative life sustainable, chosen and refined not because they are handed down from outside, but because human beings, reasoning honestly about their actual shared situation, have every practical reason to want a system like this in place and to want themselves and others disposed to follow it reliably, including in moments when following it is inconvenient. This is why Mackie insisted against a common but sloppy inference that recognizing morality as invented does not mean recognizing it as unimportant or dispensable. An invented tool can still be indispensable. The wheel was invented, not discovered, lying complete in nature, and that fact has never once given anyone a good reason to stop using wheels. This is the first serious crack in the wall of Dostoevsky's fear, and it comes from the most unlikely source, not a comforting religious thinker, not an optimist, but the single most rigorous philosophical opponent of moral objectivity in the 20th century, arguing that the death of objective moral facts is entirely compatible with, and arguably demands, a serious and disciplined practical morality built on something else. But we should not let error theory win by default, because plenty of serious philosophers think Mackie was wrong, and their arguments deserve real weight before we move any further, because the honest version of this story has to include the case for the other side, made at full strength, not as a strawman to be knocked down. Moral realism, the view that there really are objective moral facts, that some things are simply right or wrong independent of what anyone thinks, has a long and formidable pedigree, and it did not disappear just because Mackie and later writers in his tradition sharpened the skeptical case. The oldest version comes from Plato, who argued that moral properties like goodness and justice are not features of the physical world at all, but exist in a separate, non-physical realm of perfect forms, eternal and unchanging, which particular good acts or just institutions merely imitate or participate in imperfectly, the way a drawn circle imperfectly approximates the perfect mathematical concept of circularity. On this view, moral knowledge is a kind of intellectual perception of these forms, achieved through reason and philosophical training rather than sense experience, and moral facts are as objective, and in fact more objective, than facts about the physical world, since the physical world is itself, for Plato, a lesser, shifting copy of the eternal realm where the forms reside. Few contemporary philosophers accept Plato's metaphysics of forms in its original shape, but the intuition behind it, that moral truths have a kind of necessity and mind independence similar to mathematical truths, survives in more modern dress. Immanuel Kant offered a different and enormously influential route to moral objectivity, one that does not require a separate metaphysical realm of forms at all. Kant argued that the objectivity of morality is grounded not in some external Platonic heaven, but in the very structure of practical reason itself, in what it means to be a rational agent capable of acting on principles rather than merely being pushed around by impulse and desire. His categorical imperative asks you to test any proposed action by asking whether the principle behind it could be willed as a universal law, a rule that every rational being could act on without contradiction. Lying, on Kant's analysis, fails this test because a world in which everyone lied whenever it was convenient would undermine the very practice of communication that makes lying possible or useful in the first place. The maxim defeats itself if universalized. For Kant, moral obligation is objective because it derives from reason itself, from what any rational agent, simply by virtue of being rational, is committed to, not from anyone's particular desires, culture, or divine command. This gives Kant's system an appealing kind of universality without requiring belief in Platonic forms or a deity, though Kant himself, notably, thought morality also pointed toward the rational necessity of postulating God, freedom, and immortality, even if these could not be proven through theoretical reason alone. Contemporary moral realists have developed considerably more sophisticated versions of these old intuitions, often explicitly built to survive exactly the kind of arguments Mackie raised. Some, following a tradition associated with philosophers like Derek Parfit, argue that moral and rational normative truths are simply irreducible, sui generis, not the queer kind of thing Mackie feared, but rather in the same broad family as logical and mathematical truths, which are also, after all, non-natural, causally inert, and yet nobody thinks the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is somehow metaphysically embarrassing simply because it does not reduce to a physical property you can point to with a microscope. Why, these philosophers ask, should moral truths be held to a higher standard of metaphysical respectability than mathematical or logical ones? If we are comfortable saying that mathematical facts are objectively true without being physical facts, without being detectable by ordinary sense perception, and without requiring some special causal interaction with our brains to explain how we know them, why can't moral facts occupy the same category? Parfit, in his massive late work on What Matters, argued at enormous length that the queerness objection proves far too much, since it would, if taken seriously, also undermine our confidence in logical and mathematical objectivity, which almost nobody actually wants to give up. Others, working in a tradition called Cornell realism, associated with philosophers such as Richard Boyd, Nicholas Sturgeon, and David Brink, argue that moral properties are perfectly natural after all, not queer non-natural entities floating in a separate metaphysical realm, but complex natural properties much like the property of being healthy or being a functioning ecosystem, properties that supervene on and are constituted by natural, empirical facts about human flourishing, suffering, and social cooperation, discoverable in principle through something like the method of natural science, even if the details are far messier and more holistic than physics. On this view, moral facts are objective the way facts about biological function or mental health are objective, real patterns in the natural world that we can be more or less accurate about, even though they are not reducible to any single simple physical property, and even though reasonable people can disagree at the edges about exactly how to characterize them, the way doctors can disagree about edge cases of a diagnosis without that disagreement casting doubt on the existence of disease itself. A further and closely related realist strategy associated with the moral twin earth thought experiment developed by Terence Walden and Mark Timmons tries to undercut the naturalist realist's own account by asking us to imagine a distant planet inhabited by people functionally identical to us in every observable way, who use a word that sounds exactly like good, play exactly the same role in their practical reasoning and social regulation that good plays for us, but which turns out, on inspection, to pick out a different underlying natural property than the one Cornell realists claim grounds our own moral terms. The worry this raises for naturalist realism is that if two communities can use functionally identical moral vocabulary while tracking different natural properties, it becomes unclear that either community is simply discovering a single, objective moral reality out there, rather than each community constructing and applying its own internally coherent practice, which starts to sound less like the discovery of objective fact and more like a sophisticated version of relativism dressed in scientific language. Cornell realists have offered detailed responses to this challenge, generally by insisting that careful attention to what our moral terms are actually trying to track, human flourishing broadly construed, resolves the apparent divergence, but the fact that the debate remains active and technical decades after Horgan and Timmons first raised it is itself evidence of how unsettled this territory still is. There is also a body of arguments, sometimes called the companions in guilt strategy, that goes directly after Mackie's queerness worry by pointing out how many other things we are confident are objectively true, aesthetic judgments about excellence, epistemic norms about what counts as good reasoning, even scientific method itself, rest on similarly non-empirical, seemingly irreducible normative foundations, so that if queerness is fatal to moral objectivity, it looks fatal to an enormous amount of our confident, ordinary intellectual life as well, a conclusion most people, including most skeptics, are not actually willing to accept. If you are prepared to say there are objective facts about what counts as a good argument or a well-supported scientific theory, the companions in guilt argument goes, you have already accepted normative facts of roughly the same problematic metaphysical shape that Mackie objected to in the moral case, and consistency should push you toward accepting moral facts too, or toward a much broader and more uncomfortable skepticism than most people are prepared to live with. These are real arguments made by serious philosophers, and this piece is not going to pretend they have been decisively refuted, because metaethics, unusually among philosophical subfields, remains a genuinely live and unsettled argument among extremely capable people who have thought about almost nothing else for entire careers. What can be said, honestly, is that the realist side has not managed to produce anything like a knockdown argument that ends the dispute any more than the anti-realist side has. Surveys of professional philosophers consistently find the field roughly, though not perfectly, split, with a modest lean towards some form of moral realism, but with enough sophisticated anti-realists, error theorists, expressivists, and constructivists in serious philosophy departments that no honest observer can claim the question is settled science. This matters because it means the fear at the center of this piece, what happens if morality is not objectively real, is not a fringe worry about a position everyone sensible has already rejected. It is a live possibility that a substantial portion of the people who have thought hardest and most rigorously about the subject take completely seriously. Given that live possibility, there is a much cruder and much more common response to the death of objective morality that deserves to be examined, and, this piece will argue, largely dismissed because it is often confused with sophisticated error theory when it is actually something considerably weaker. That response is relativism, and it is worth being careful about it because relativism is not the same thing as nihilism, even though the two get lumped together constantly in casual conversation, and understanding exactly how they differ clears up a great deal of confusion. Cultural relativism, in its classic anthropological form, holds that moral standards are not universal or objective but are relative to particular cultures, that what counts as right or wrong is simply whatever a given society's norms say it is, and that there is no neutral, culture-independent standpoint from which one culture's moral code can be judged superior to another's. This position has real intellectual history behind it, most influentially in the work of early 20th century anthropologists like Franz Boas and his students, who were reacting, for genuinely good reasons, against a smug Victorian assumption that European Christian moral norms represented the pinnacle of civilization against which all other cultures, past and present, should be measured and found primitive. Relativism as an anthropological corrective, a discipline of humility that says approach unfamiliar practices with curiosity rather than immediate condemnation, try to understand a moral code from within the logic and needs of the society that produced it before rushing to judge it, has done real and valuable work. It is a useful methodological starting point for anyone trying to understand a culture different from their own. But relativism as a metaethical position, the claim that this is simply what morality is, nothing more than whatever a given society happens to endorse, runs into serious philosophical trouble the moment you try to push on it, and the trouble is worth walking through carefully because it is different from, and in some ways more severe than, the trouble facing error theory. The first problem is the reformer's dilemma. If morality is simply whatever a given society's norms say it is, then moral reformers, the abolitionists working against slavery in a slave-holding society, the suffragists working against a society that denied women the vote, anyone at all who stands within their own culture and says our practices are wrong, we must change, are not merely disagreeing with their society. They are, on strict cultural relativism, simply mistaken about what morality is, since morality just is whatever the prevailing social consensus happens to be at that moment, and the reformers' view, being a minority view within the culture at the time, would by definition be the less correct one, at least until it wins and becomes the new consensus, at which point it retroactively becomes correct simply by virtue of having won. This makes moral progress understood as movement towards something genuinely better rather than mere movement to something different, almost impossible to make sense of. It reduces the entire history of moral reform to a series of cultures simply changing their minds, with no framework available for saying the change was actually an improvement rather than just a different, equally valid, arbitrary configuration. The second problem is that relativism cannot easily account for moral disagreement between cultures in the way it initially seems to promise. If a society that practices widespread slavery and a society that has abolished it are each simply following their own internally valid moral codes, in what sense are they actually disagreeing at all? Real disagreement requires that both parties be making claims about the same subject matter that cannot both be true. But relativism, taken consistently, seems to dissolve cross-cultural moral disagreement into something more like the difference between a country that drives on the left and a country that drives on the right, not a disagreement at all but simply two different, equally valid conventions that happen not to match. Many people who are initially drawn to relativism because it seems tolerant and humble discover, on reflection, that they do not actually want to say that a society's practice of, say, systematic torture or genocide is merely a different, equally valid convention, no more or less correct than a society that condemns it. The moral force behind most people's initial attraction to relativism, respect for cultural difference, tolerance, epistemic humility, turns out to be smuggling in a substantive moral commitment, usually something like a value of tolerance itself, that relativism, followed consistently, cannot actually ground, because if morality really is just whatever a culture endorses, then a culture that endorses intolerance has just as much claim to correctness as a culture that endorses tolerance, and the relativist has no non-arbitrary way to prefer one over the other, even though in practice almost every relativist does prefer tolerance, which suggests they do not actually believe their own theory all the way down. There is a further, more subtle problem with relativism worth naming, sometimes called the boundary problem. If moral truth is relative to a culture, some fact of the matter is needed about where one culture ends and another begins, since human beings do not sort neatly into discrete, internally uniform cultural units with clean edges. A modern nation contains multiple overlapping subcultures, generations with sharply different values, immigrant communities straddling two or more traditions at once, and individuals who reject significant parts of the culture they were raised in while accepting others. Relativism owes an account of which culture is doing the relativizing in any given case, and every attempt to specify this either collapses into an unworkable individualism, in which the relevant unit is simply each person's own private framework, at which point relativism has quietly become something closer to pure subjectivism, indistinguishable in practice from simply saying morality is personal preference, or it has to draw boundaries around cultures in a way that is itself arbitrary and contestable, undermining the very idea that culture is a stable, well-defined unit capable of grounding truth in the first place. This is why serious philosophers on both the realist and the anti-realist side of the debate, including most error theorists, tend to have relatively little patience for simple relativism as a resting place. Mackie himself was not a relativist in this crude sense. His argument from relativity was evidence used to support error theory, the conclusion that there are no objective moral facts at all, not the conclusion that moral facts are relative to and constituted by whatever a culture happens to believe. Those are two very different claims, and it is worth being precise about the difference. Error theory says moral claims aim at objectivity and fail, making them uniformly false. Relativism says moral claims are actually true, but only relative to a cultural framework, which is a completely different logical structure, closer to how claims about what is fashionable or what counts as polite might be true relative to a particular social context. The reason relativism is not where this piece is going to land, and not where most serious moral anti-realists land either, is that it tries to have the comfort of moral truth. Claims can still be true. We're not really abandoning morality without actually paying the metaphysical price of explaining what makes those truths binding on anyone who does not already accept the cultural framework, which leaves it vulnerable to exactly the charge Nietzsche would have leveled at it, that it is nihilism wearing a disguise of humility, unwilling to admit what it has actually given up. So set relativism aside as an unstable resting point, and turn instead to a question that has become increasingly central to this whole debate in the last several decades, one that neither Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, nor even Mackie had full access to in the form we have it today. What does evolutionary biology tell us about where our moral sense actually comes from? And does that story support or undermine the idea that morality tracks something objectively real? Charles Darwin himself took the question of morality's origin seriously in The Descent of Man, arguing that the moral sense, what he called the social instincts, could plausibly have evolved through natural selection because a species with strong social bonds, capable of sympathy, mutual aid, and group loyalty, would tend to outcompete groups lacking these traits, particularly in a species like ours that depends heavily on cooperation for survival. This was already, in the 19th century, a naturalistic origin story for morality, one that did not require any special divine implantation of a moral faculty, and it has been refined considerably by 20th and 21st century evolutionary biology and psychology. The modern picture is built out of several distinct but complementary mechanisms. Gene selection, formalized mathematically by William Hamilton, explains why organisms often behave altruistically toward genetic relatives, since relatives share genes. A gene that inclines an organism to sacrifice some of its own reproductive success to help a sibling or offspring survive can still increase in frequency across the population because it is helping copies of itself housed in other bodies. This is not altruism in any morally loaded sense from the gene's eye view. It is simply differential reproduction, but it produces organisms, including humans, with real, felt, subjectively experienced impulses to care intensely about family. Reciprocal altruism, developed by Robert Trivers, extends the explanation to cooperation between non-relatives in a social species where individuals interact repeatedly over time. An organism that helps others and is helped in return does better than one that never cooperates, but this system is vulnerable to cheaters, individuals who accept help without reciprocating, which creates evolutionary pressure not just for cooperative instincts but for the capacity to detect cheaters, to feel indignation and desire for punishment when cheated, and to feel guilt when caught cheating oneself, since guilt that leads to appeasement and reputation repair can be more evolutionarily advantageous than guilt-free cheating that eventually gets you excluded from all future cooperation. Add to this the pressures of group selection, or, in updated and more careful modern versions, multi-level selection, in which groups with better internal cooperation and stronger norms against free-riding can outcompete groups that lack them, and you have the beginnings of a fairly comprehensive naturalistic explanation for why creatures like us evolved with such powerful, immediate, emotionally loaded reactions to concepts like fairness, loyalty, cheating, harm, and reciprocity. The exact same territory that moral philosophy has always been concerned with. This evolutionary story matters enormously for the objectivity debate because of an argument developed with particular force by philosopher Sharon Street in the early 21st century, known as the evolutionary debunking argument against moral realism. Street's argument runs roughly like this. Our moral intuitions, the gut-level sense that cruelty is wrong, that fairness matters, that betraying an ally is bad, were shaped overwhelmingly by natural selection acting to promote reproductive fitness, not by any process that was tracking mind-independent moral truth. Selection favored ancestors who felt strongly that they should protect their offspring, cooperate with their in-group, punish cheaters, and reciprocate favors because those feelings, on average, over millions of years, led to more surviving descendants, not because those feelings happened to correspond to objective facts about a moral realm that, on the realist's own account, exerts no causal influence on the physical world and therefore could not have influenced which mutations got selected for. Given this, Street argues, moral realists face a devastating dilemma. Either they say the forces that shaped our moral intuitions were tracking the independent moral truth, in which case they need to explain the wildly implausible causal mechanism by which a causally inert realm of non-natural moral facts somehow steered the blind, purely mechanical process of natural selection, which realists have never managed to do convincingly. Or they admit that the forces that shaped our intuitions had nothing to do with tracking moral truth, in which case it would be a staggering, almost miraculous coincidence if those evolutionarily shaped intuitions just happened to line up with the independent moral facts anyway, the way it would be a wild coincidence if a compass that was built and calibrated with no reference to magnetic north nonetheless always pointed exactly at magnetic north. Either way, Street argues, the realist's confidence that our moral intuitions are actually tracking objective moral truth looks unjustified once you understand where those intuitions actually came from. Moral realists have not been silent in response to this, and the exchanges have become one of the liveliest corners of contemporary metaethics. Some, like Eric Wielenberg, argue that at least the most general, formal moral truths such as that suffering is bad or that there is a reason to care about the interests of others may have been reliably tracked by evolution simply because creatures who cared about their own suffering and the suffering of their offspring were more likely to survive, so that evolution, while not aiming at moral truth, happened to select for exactly the kind of psychological states that a correct moral theory would also endorse, a kind of fortunate alignment between fitness and truth, at least at the most basic level, even if the alignment breaks down for more specific and culturally variable moral judgments. Others argue that Street's argument, like the queerness argument before it, proves too much since it seems to threaten confidence in mathematical and logical intuitions too, which also were not selected for their truth-tracking accuracy in any direct sense but for their usefulness in helping ancestors navigate the physical and social world, and yet we do not generally conclude from this that arithmetic is not objectively true. But whichever way that particular technical argument ultimately resolves, and it remains genuinely unresolved, the deeper point for our purposes is this: evolutionary biology gives us, for the first time in the history of this debate, a detailed, empirically grounded, non-mysterious explanation for why human beings experience morality as though it were an external, binding, objective force, a phenomenology of obligation, even if metaphysically it turns out to be nothing more than a set of powerful, useful, deeply ingrained social instincts. This is important because it directly answers a question that has hovered over this entire piece since the beginning. If there are no objective moral facts, why does it feel so overwhelmingly like there are? Why did Ivan Karamazov feel the wrongness of a tortured child in his bones rather than simply noting it as a fact about social convention? The evolutionary story gives a good answer. Feeling morality as external, as binding, as non-negotiable, as something you discover rather than invent, was almost certainly more useful over evolutionary time than feeling it as a mere preference. A creature that experiences the norm against cheating as an arbitrary social convention it could abandon whenever convenient is a worse cooperative partner and a more exposed target for punishment than a creature that experiences that same norm as a deep, quasi-perceptual, non-negotiable truth about the world, one it would feel genuine guilt and shame about violating even in secret, even when no one would ever find out. Evolution, in other words, may have built moral realists out of us psychologically, whether or not moral realism is metaphysically true, because the psychological experience of realism, the felt sense of objective bindingness, was fitness enhancing regardless of its metaphysical accuracy. This does not settle the philosophical question of whether objective moral facts exist. But it does something almost as important for the purposes of this piece. It explains why the intuition that they must exist, the intuition Dostoevsky leaned on so heavily, is exactly what you would expect a highly social, cooperation-dependent primate to have regardless of the actual metaphysical facts, which should make us at least somewhat suspicious of treating that intuition as decisive evidence on its own. It is worth adding one more layer to the evolutionary picture before moving on, because it helps explain not just why moral feeling exists but why it feels so specifically objective, so much like perception of an external fact rather than mere preference, which is exactly the phenomenology that has driven philosophers toward realism for millennia. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt's work on moral intuition, building on earlier work by cognitive scientists studying rapid, automatic judgment, found that moral evaluations typically arrive in consciousness first, fast, automatic, and emotionally loaded. The way a face is recognized as familiar before you consciously work out why, with explicit reasoning showing up only afterward, mostly to construct a justification for a verdict the mind has already reached. Haidt called this the social intuitionist model, and part of what makes it relevant here is what it implies about the feeling of objectivity itself. An intuition that arrives fast, automatically, and with strong emotional force will simply feel like a perception of something real and external, in exactly the way visual perception feels like direct contact with the world, even though it is, at the neurological level, an elaborate construction performed by the brain. Nobody experiences seeing a red apple as my visual system has constructed a subjective representation of wavelength data. It simply feels like seeing red out there on the apple. Moral judgment on this account works the same way. The felt sense that cruelty is objectively wrong, that it is a fact you are perceiving rather than a preference you are generating, may simply be what a fast, evolutionarily tuned, high-stakes evaluative system feels like from the inside, regardless of whether there is an actual external moral fact being tracked. This gives a second, independent, psychologically grounded explanation, alongside the evolutionary fitness story, for why moral realism has always felt so intuitively compelling to ordinary moral experience, even if it turns out, on the metaphysical scorecard, to be false. The intuition of objectivity, in other words, may be exactly what a certain kind of well-functioning, socially calibrated brain produces, whether or not objectivity is actually there to be found, which should make us cautious about treating the sheer strength of the intuition as decisive evidence either way. This matters practically too, and it connects directly back to the empirical question of what happens to people who give up belief in objective morality, because it suggests the feeling of moral seriousness, the visceral sense that some things really do matter, does not require the metaphysical belief to keep functioning. Haidt's own research found that this fast, intuitive moral machinery operates across a wider range of foundations than a narrow focus on harm and fairness alone would suggest, including intuitions about loyalty, authority, and purity that vary considerably across cultures and political orientations, which is itself a finding with real implications for the relativism debate discussed earlier. Some of the disagreement Mackie pointed to as evidence against objective morality may reflect not different societies groping toward the same truth with different degrees of success, and not pure arbitrary convention either, but different weightings of a shared, evolved suite of moral foundations, weighted differently by different ecological and social pressures, a middle position between strict relativism and strict objectivism that a growing number of moral psychologists now find more empirically defensible than either extreme. And this brings us, finally, to the turn this piece had been building toward from the very beginning, the twist that neither Nietzsche's Übermensch, nor Dostoevsky's despairing Ivan, nor even Mackie's careful error theory fully worked out in its practical implications, though Mackie came closest. If our moral feelings, our sense of fairness, our capacity for empathy, our indignation at cruelty, our desire for reciprocity and loyalty are not perceptions of an external moral order but are instead deeply, evolutionarily, psychologically real features of what it is to be a human being, features every bit as stable, every bit as universal across the species, and every bit as resistant to casual override as our capacity for language or our fear of heights, then the absence of objective moral facts does not actually remove the material out of which a functioning, stable, even rigorous ethical life can be built. It just changes what that material is made of. It stops being cosmic law and starts being something more like shared human nature plus the practical requirements of living together, and it turns out that combination is far more solid, far less arbitrary, and far less prone to collapsing into chaos than either the religious defenders of objective morality or the frightened critics of nihilism generally assume. This is not a new insight invented for this piece. It has a long philosophical lineage, and it is worth walking through several of its most developed forms because together they constitute a serious, constructive answer to the question posed at the very beginning: what actually happens when you stop believing morality is objectively real? Start with existentialism, and specifically with Jean-Paul Sartre, who inherited the Nietzschean diagnosis of a godless universe and pushed it into a fully developed philosophy of human freedom and responsibility. Sartre's famous formulation was that existence precedes essence, unlike a manufactured object, say a paper knife, which is made according to a concept, a purpose, an essence that exists in the mind of the craftsman before the object itself exists. A human being simply exists first, is thrown into the world without a pre-given purpose or nature, and only afterward, through choices and actions, defines what they are. There is no God to have designed human nature with a built-in moral purpose, and therefore, Sartre argued, there is no human nature in the old sense at all, no essence given in advance that could tell you what you objectively ought to do with your life. This sounds, on first hearing, like exactly the recipe for nihilistic despair that Dostoevsky feared, but Sartre's actual conclusion runs in a strikingly different direction. Because there is no pre-given nature or objective value system to fall back on, human beings are, in Sartre's phrase, condemned to be free. Every choice you make without the excuse of "I had no choice" or "the universe demanded this of me," and this radical freedom is, for Sartre, not a license for careless self-indulgence but the source of an enormous and inescapable responsibility, because in choosing for yourself what to value and how to act, you are, in a real sense, choosing an image of what a human being ought to be, an image you are implicitly recommending to everyone else through the very fact of your choice. Sartre's ethics of authenticity does not derive specific moral rules from an objective source, but it is very far from anything goes. It demands that you take full ownership of your choices, that you not hide behind bad faith, the comfortable self-deception of pretending you are simply following orders, playing a role, or obeying an external law that leaves you innocent of the outcome, and that you recognize your freedom is bound up with the freedom of everyone else, since willing your own freedom authentically, for Sartre, requires willing the freedom of others too. Whatever one thinks of the details, the structure of the argument matters. The absence of a pre-given, cosmic moral order, for Sartre, produces not moral collapse but an intensified, almost unbearable sense of moral responsibility, because there is no longer anyone else, no God, no fixed human nature, no objective law to blame or to hide behind. Albert Camus took a related but distinct path, one that deserves particular attention because it addresses the emotional register of this whole question, the feeling of vertigo and meaninglessness, more directly than most other thinkers in this tradition. Camus described the fundamental human situation as absurd. We are creatures with a deep, apparently ineradicable need for meaning, clarity, and purpose, confronting a universe that offers none of these things, that is simply silent in response to our demands. The absurd, for Camus, is not a property of the universe alone or of human consciousness alone, but the collision between the two, the friction generated when a meaning-hungry mind meets a meaning-indifferent cosmos. Camus considered and explicitly rejected both of what he saw as the two most common responses to this recognition. The first is what he called philosophical suicide, leaping back into some form of transcendent faith or system, religious or ideological, that promises to paper over the absurd with an artificial guarantee of ultimate meaning, a move Camus considered a form of intellectual cowardice, a refusal to look directly at the actual human situation. The second is literal suicide, deciding that if life has no inherent meaning it is not worth living at all, a conclusion Camus also rejected, and rejected forcefully, arguing that it actually resolves the tension of the absurd rather than living inside it honestly, since it eliminates one of the two terms of the collision, the conscious mind, rather than holding both terms, the demand for meaning and the universe's silence, together without collapsing either one. What Camus proposed instead, most famously in his essay on the myth of Sisyphus, was a third path: revolt. Lie fully inside the absurd, without illusions, without transcendent guarantees, and choose deliberately and repeatedly to affirm life anyway, to find it worth living precisely through the act of engaging with it passionately, honestly, and without appeal to a cosmic justification that will never arrive. Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down every single time, is for Camus not a tragic figure to be pitied but, in the essay's famous closing line, someone we must imagine happy because he has stopped looking to the gods for meaning and has claimed his struggle, his fate, his rock, as entirely his own. The rock does not get lighter. The absence of cosmic justification does not disappear. But the human capacity to find the struggle worth undertaking anyway, Camus insists, is real, available, and does not require the universe's permission. It is worth noting how Sartre and Camus, despite starting from the same diagnosis of a universe without inherent meaning, arrived at views with real practical friction between them, and the disagreement itself is instructive. Sartre, for all his emphasis on radical freedom, still believed that authentic choice, honestly made, generates something like an implicit ethical demand, a commitment to willing freedom universally rather than only for oneself, which pulls his existentialism back toward a recognizably humanist and other regarding morality even without objective foundations. Camus was more suspicious of any system, including Sartre's, that tried to derive determinate ethical conclusions from the bare fact of freedom, worrying that this reintroduced exactly the kind of totalizing certainty of philosophy that claims to know what revolt must lead to, that he thought the honest confrontation with the absurd should resist. Camus's own later work, especially The Rebel, tried to work out a more modest, tentatively grounded ethics of limits, arguing that the same act of rebellion against a meaningless universe that affirms the value of one's own life logically commits the rebel to affirming the value of every other life as well, since the rebellion was never really about the particular individual doing the rebelling but about human dignity as such wherever it appears. Whether or not this argument fully succeeds as a piece of logic, its significance for this piece is the same as Sartre's. Both thinkers, starting from an unflinching acceptance that the universe offers no objective moral guarantee, nonetheless worked hard, seriously, and at length to show that something recognizably like solidarity, dignity, and care for others follows anyway, not because the cosmos demands it, but because of what it actually means to be a conscious, mortal, meaning-seeking creature living among other conscious, mortal, meaning-seeking creatures. Move from these existentialist responses to a more technical and, in some ways, more directly relevant strand of contemporary metaethics, expressivism and quasi-realism, associated most closely with philosophers like Alan Gibbard and, in its most influential form, Simon Blackburn. Quasi-realism starts from roughly the same place as Mackie's error theory, denying that there are objective, mind-independent moral facts in the metaphysically robust sense Mackie was arguing against, but it takes a different route from there. Rather than concluding that ordinary moral statements are therefore all false, quasi-realism argues that moral language functions primarily to express certain kinds of attitudes, endorsements, commitments, sentiments of approval and disapproval, rather than to describe an independent moral reality in something like the way Hume long ago suggested that moral distinctions are derived from feeling rather than from reason alone. But Blackburn's crucial and much debated move is to argue that a sophisticated expressivism can nonetheless earn the right to talk and reason in all the ways that make moral discourse look, on the surface, exactly like realist discourse. We can still say some moral claims are true and others false. Relative to a broadly shared framework of attitudes, we can still engage in moral reasoning, consistency checking, and argument. We can still say some people's moral views are better supported, more coherent, or more defensible than others. We can still feel the full emotional weight of moral conviction, of genuine outrage at cruelty and genuine admiration for courage, without needing to posit a mysterious non-natural moral property floating somewhere in the universe to justify that conviction. The point of quasi-realism is that giving up the metaphysics of objective moral facts does not require giving up the practice of serious, rigorous, emotionally engaged moral life, because it turns out that almost everything we actually do when we reason morally, weighing consequences, checking for consistency, imagining ourselves in another's position, testing our judgments against considered cases, can be reconstructed entirely within a framework of structured, reflectively endorsed human attitudes, without needing an extra layer of mind-independent moral fact sitting behind it and guaranteeing it from outside. A related but more explicitly political and practical tradition, moral constructivism and social contract theory, offers perhaps the most concrete answer yet to the question of how a functioning morality gets built without appeal to cosmic guarantees. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century amid the trauma of the English Civil War, imagined human beings in a hypothetical state of nature prior to any government or shared moral or legal framework, and argued that life in such a condition would be a war of all against all, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, not because human beings are uniquely wicked but simply because, absent any enforced cooperative structure, rational self-interested creatures with roughly equal capacity to harm one another and with limited resources to compete over will find conflict individually rational even when it is collectively disastrous. Hobbes's solution was not an appeal to objective moral law handed down from outside, but a strictly practical one. Rational agents, recognizing the catastrophic costs of the state of nature, have overwhelming self-interested reason to construct and submit to a shared system of enforceable rules, a social contract that makes cooperation possible and reliable. This is morality, or at least the political and legal backbone of morality, built from the ground up out of nothing but rational self-interest and the practical structure of the problem, no cosmic guarantor required. John Rawls, 3 centuries later, refined this contractarian tradition enormously with his device of the original position, asking what principles of justice rational people would agree to if they had to choose the basic structure of their society from behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing in advance what position, what talents, what class, what race, or what conception of the good life they themselves would end up occupying within that society. Rawls argued that rational self-interested agents reasoning under this veil of uncertainty about their own future position would not gamble on a society that permits extreme inequality or the oppression of minorities because they might turn out to be the ones oppressed, and would instead converge on principles guaranteeing basic liberties for all and arranging any social and economic inequalities so that they work to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. What makes the Hobbesian and Rawlsian traditions important for this piece is that they demonstrate in rigorous and influential detail that you can derive demanding substantive principles of justice and cooperation entirely from the structure of rational choice under conditions of uncertainty and competing interests without needing to import a single objective moral fact from outside the process. The fairness is not discovered lying around in the universe. It is constructed, through a specific and defensible procedure, out of nothing more than rationality and the shared practical situation of creatures who have to live together. There is also a body of empirical psychological research separate from these philosophical traditions but strongly reinforcing their conclusions, that speaks directly and concretely to Dostoevsky's fear because it moves the question from armchair speculation about what would happen if people stopped believing in objective morality to an actual empirical investigation of what happens to people who, as a matter of documented fact, already do not believe in it. Studies of committed atheists, secular humanists, and philosophers who explicitly hold aretheoretic or anti-realist metaethical views have not found them to be, on average, less moral, less prosocial, less trustworthy, or more prone to criminal or cruel behavior than people who hold robust religious or metaphysically realist commitments about morality. If anything, some empirical work on secular societies, comparing measures like violent crime rates, charitable behavior, and social trust across highly secular versus highly religious nations, has found the opposite of what the classical fear would predict, with some of the most secular societies on earth ranking among the safest, most cooperative, and most socially trusting in the world, though this comparison is complicated by an enormous number of other variables: wealth, education, social welfare infrastructure, historical circumstance, and should not be oversimplified into a simple causal claim that disbelief in objective morality causes good behavior. The more careful and more interesting finding, replicated across a range of studies in moral psychology, is that people's actual moral behavior correlates far more strongly with things like empathic capacity, attachment security, social belonging, exposure to norms of reciprocity and fairness in their communities, and plain habituation, having been raised and practiced into caring about others, than it correlates with their explicit philosophical beliefs about the metaphysical status of moral facts. Most human beings, it turns out, including most professional philosophers who spend their careers arguing that morality has no objective foundation, do not actually experience a moment of realization followed by a collapse of their caring about others. Derek Parfit himself, one of the 20th century's most rigorous defenders of moral realism, noted with something like bafflement that many of his fellow philosophers who accepted anti-realist metaethical positions nonetheless continued to live scrupulously, carefully moral lives, a fact he considered slightly puzzling given his own view of the stakes, but a fact nonetheless. The philosophical belief and the practical disposition, it turns out, are much more loosely coupled than either Dostoevsky's novel or casual pop culture nihilism assumes. What explains this gap between the theoretical fear and the empirical reality? Several things, and pulling them together gives us the actual answer to the question this piece opened with. The first is that moral motivation for almost all human beings was never actually running on a metaethical belief in the first place. Nobody, as a small child learning not to hit their sibling, first absorbed a sophisticated philosophical argument for moral realism and only then began to feel empathy and guilt. The order runs the other way. The feelings, empathy, guilt, indignation at unfairness, come first, built into us by development, attachment, and further back, evolution, and the philosophical beliefs about the metaphysical status of those feelings get layered on much later, if at all, by the small percentage of people who ever think about metaethics explicitly. For the vast majority of moral life, in the vast majority of people, the engine driving behavior was never a belief in cosmic moral law to begin with. It was something more like trained, felt, embodied concern for others, the same concern that evolutionary psychology explains in naturalistic terms. Removing the metaphysical belief for someone whose actual moral motivation was never running on that belief changes far less than the classical fear assumes, in the same way that discovering that the specific religious story you were told about why lying is wrong turns out to be false does not, for most people, actually make them start lying more, because the aversion to lying was never really running on the religious story in the first place. It was running on empathy, social trust, and habituated character. The second reason is that a great deal of what actually holds moral life together is not metaphysical at all but structural and social. Reputation, reciprocity, social sanction, legal enforcement, cultural transmission of norms through parenting, education, and religious and civic institutions, and the simple accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of trial and error about which practices allow groups of humans to live together successfully and which ones lead to their own destruction. None of that machinery depends on the metaphysical objectivity of the underlying values. A society does not need its members to believe that fairness is a Platonic form in order to enforce norms of fairness through law, custom, social approval, and the plain observable fact that societies which tolerate rampant cheating and betrayal tend to fall apart, lose the trust that makes cooperation possible, and get outcompeted historically and practically by societies that manage cooperation better. This is, in a sense, Mackie's own point in the second half of his book, dressed in sociological rather than purely philosophical clothing. Morality as invention rather than discovery is still morality, still binding in every practical sense that matters for actually living well together, because the binding force was always coming from human need, human psychology, and social structure, not from a metaphysical guarantee that was, on reflection, doing remarkably little actual work even when people believed in it. The third and perhaps most philosophically interesting reason returns us to where this piece began, with Nietzsche's distinction between passive and active nihilism, and it is worth making explicit now what was only implicit before. The fear that abandoning objective morality leads to chaos assumes a particular and, on reflection, quite narrow picture of what would have to happen, that morality is like a retaining wall holding back a flood of pure, undifferentiated selfish impulse, and that once you remove the wall the flood simply pours through unimpeded. But this picture radically understates how much of what a human being wants, cares about, and finds meaningful is itself already other-regarding, cooperative, and relational, not because an external law commanded it but because human beings are, at the most basic psychological level, social animals whose own flourishing is deeply bound up with the flourishing of people they love, people they depend on, and the communities that give their lives structure and significance. Remove the metaphysical guarantee and you do not remove the desire for connection, the pain of loneliness, the pleasure of being trusted, the satisfaction of raising children well, the discomfort of guilt, the warmth of friendship, or the countless other psychologically real, evolutionarily ancient, thoroughly human motivations that were never actually derived from belief in objective moral facts in the first place. What you remove is a particular kind of intellectual certainty, a guarantee that your values are cosmically endorsed, are the correct ones in some final, universe-sanctioned sense. What you are left with, if you handle the loss well, in something closer to Nietzsche's active mode than his passive one, is the recognition that you have to take responsibility for your values yourself, weigh them, refine them, defend them through argument and example rather than through appeal to an authority that was never actually available to settle the argument for you in the first place, since even in a world with objective moral facts people still had to argue, reason, and disagree about what those facts actually were. Which means moral reasoning was always doing the real work, objectivity or not. This is, in the end, the answer this piece had been building toward. Moral nihilism, taken as a serious metaethical position rather than a cartoon villain, does not deliver the world Ivan Karamazov feared and Smerdyakov acted on. It does not, in itself, license cruelty, because cruelty was never actually restrained by metaphysics in the first place. It was restrained, imperfectly and unevenly but really, by empathy, social structure, reciprocity, law, and the accumulated practical wisdom of a cooperative species, none of which requires the further claim that any of it is written into the fabric of the cosmos. What moral nihilism does deliver, honestly confronted rather than merely feared from a distance, is something closer to what Nietzsche called active nihilism and what Sartre called radical freedom and what Camus called revolt and what the contractarians called construction, the recognition that the human practice of caring about one another, of building fairness and honesty and kindness into the structures of shared life, is not a discovery we made about a pre-existing cosmic order but an achievement, ongoing, unfinished, and entirely our own, that we have every reason, rooted in our own nature and our own dependence on one another, to keep building whether or not the universe was ever watching. There is a final thread worth pulling before closing, because it addresses the objection a careful listener will already be forming, even granting everything argued so far, that moral feeling survives the loss of metaphysical objectivity, that constructed moralities can be rigorous rather than arbitrary, that most actual nihilists live ordinary decent lives. Doesn't the loss of objectivity still remove any way of saying a constructed morality could be wrong, in the way we clearly want to be able to say that a society built on slavery or a regime built on genocide is not merely different from ours but worse? This is the strongest version of the fear, sharper than Ivan Karamazov's slogan, because it does not require imagining a murderer reasoning his way to permission, it only requires imagining that we lose our own standing to condemn. The constructive tradition surveyed here has real resources to answer this, even without falling back into objective moral facts. A constructed morality, on the Hobbesian, Rawlsian, and quasi-realist accounts, is not constructed arbitrarily, the way a preference for one flavor of ice cream over another is arbitrary. It is constrained tightly by real facts, facts about what creatures like us need to flourish, facts about what kinds of arrangements collapse under their own internal contradictions or provoke their own resistance, facts about what a person could coherently will if they did not already know which side of an arrangement they would end up on. A social order built on slavery is not merely different from one that isn't, it is one that could not be endorsed by anyone reasoning honestly from behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, since no rational person, uncertain whether they would be enslaved or enslaver, would accept the arrangement. This is a genuine, substantive, non-arbitrary standard for condemnation, even though it does not require positing a mind-independent moral fact hovering somewhere outside human reasoning altogether. The condemnation is not weaker for being constructed this way. It is arguably more useful because it comes with an actual explanation of what makes the arrangement wrong, available to anyone willing to reason through the argument rather than resting on a bare assertion that the universe disapproves, an assertion that, as Mackie pointed out, nobody has ever actually been able to verify by any method resembling the ones we trust for verifying anything else. Perhaps this is why the button at the very beginning is so hard to press and also, on reflection, less catastrophic than it first appeared. Pressing it would not actually change whether you feel the pull to comfort a crying child, whether betrayal by a friend would still wound you, whether you would still feel something close to reverence in the presence of real courage or real sacrifice. It would change only your account of why those responses arise, moving the explanation from a cosmic register to a human one. That is a genuine loss, the loss of a certain kind of cosmic backup, a guarantee that someone or something out there agrees with you about what matters. But it turns out, examined honestly rather than merely feared, that human beings were never actually leaning on that guarantee as heavily as they believed. The scaffolding was real. The building was already standing on its own.